What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are going to be going over fantasy football players that I am panicking on going into week 17 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you do enjoy today's content or find it helpful, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. We will be going over a couple players today that have been starters for a lot of you guys through a majority of the fantasy season. I'm not saying that you need to 100% bench these players, but if you feel like you have players with better matchups or more upside, you definitely may want to consider them going into what is the most important week of fantasy football for a majority of fantasy managers. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, no surprise here. We are starting things off with Josh Jacobs, who will face the San Francisco 49ers, the unit that is allowing the least amount of fantasy points to the running back position. Josh Jacobs had just 6 points in week 16 against the Pittsburgh Steelers and 13 points against New England in week 15. Those were his two lowest fantasy marks since week 9 of the fantasy football season against the Jacksonville Jaguars, where he had 11.7 fantasy points. He is still your RB3 so far on the season, but he gets literally the worst possible matchup this week. And now we have the news of Derek Carr getting benched for the Raiders, and the news that Jarrett Stidham will start at the quarterback position for the Raiders against literally the best defense probably in the entire league. It's an awful game script for Josh Jacobs. It's an awful matchup, both from a real life football perspective and from a fantasy football perspective. But at the end of the day, Josh Jacobs may have single-handedly carried you to the fantasy playoffs and helped get you to the fantasy championship, but he is just a player that I'm very concerned about this week. You could argue that Jacobs could see more volume because of the situation at the quarterback position, but the Niners have a very good offense, an extremely stout defense, and I just don't think the Raiders are going to be in a position where they can afford to run the football a lot. And even if they need to, I just really don't see circumstances where they have a lot of success, even with a player as skilled as Josh Jacobs going up against this Niners defense. So if you feel like you have enough depth at the running back position and better options at the running back position, I would seriously consider benching Josh Jacobs going into week 17 of the season. All right, next up on the list, we've got Nick Chubb. He goes up against the Washington Commanders, a top 5 unit against the running back position from a fantasy perspective. Chubb is coming in as your RB7 so far on the season. He has 11 or less fantasy points in his last 4 matchups against the Texans, the Bengals, the Ravens, and the Saints. Some good run defenses in there, some not so good run defenses in there as well, including the Texans. This week he gets the toughest matchup out of that bunch, going up against the Washington Commanders, a game that's very important for the Washington Commanders as they are fighting to keep their playoff picture alive. And on the other hand, a game that means nothing for the Browns as they have already been eliminated from the playoffs. So I just don't necessarily like the game script here, because I think the Commanders, who have a decent enough defense, are going to be forcing the Browns to throw the football. B, it's not a good matchup for Nick Chubb. And C, Nick Chubb's production has completely tanked since week 13 when Deshaun Watson took over at the quarterback position. So Chubb hasn't really been the best start in the last couple weeks, but he's still a top 10 running back on the season. He's still a player who could boom at any moment, but I just don't love him going into week 17. All right, next up, we've got Garrett Wilson of the Jets, who's had kind of an up and down season. Since week 8 of the season, he's only hit single-digit fantasy performances twice. Last week against the Jacksonville Jaguars and week 11 against the New England Patriots. Overall, he's your wide receiver 18 on the season. He's had a lot of different quarterback play. He gets Mike White, the one and only, the legend, back this week in week 17. It's a very important game for both the Jets and the Seahawks, as both teams are fighting to keep their playoff hopes alive. So I will say that I think Wilson has a pretty good opportunity against the Seahawks, who rank in the top 5 against opposing wide receivers from a fantasy perspective, a tough matchup. But most importantly here, the Seahawks have played very, very well against opposing wide receiver ones. They'll have Tariq Woolen at the cornerback position for the Seahawks, a rookie going up against Garrett Wilson, a rookie at the wide receiver position. Both have had really good seasons. Be interesting to see who kind of emerges at the top, but there's definitely a strong opportunity that Woolen comes out on top over Wilson. But Wilson, just due to volume, could still have a decent game. I just don't think he necessarily holds as much upside as maybe some other receivers out there. So once again, if you have better options, maybe options that hold more upside, you might want to consider them over Garrett Wilson going into week 17. All right, we've got another Browns player on the list, Amari Cooper, another player for the Browns who has seen his production really dip since week 13 when Deshaun Watson took over at the quarterback position. He had 9.8 or less fantasy points his first 3 weeks with Watson. Then last week, a little bit of a better performance against the Saints with 13.2 fantasy points. This week, he gets the Washington Commanders. They come in as the 12th best team against opposing wide receivers from a fantasy perspective. But the important thing is, Cooper's also been a little bit banged up over the past couple of weeks, dealing with a hip injury. So I think that's kind of been nagging him as well. He hasn't necessarily been 100%. Once again, like we mentioned with Nick Chubb, this game means nothing for the Browns. It means everything for the Commanders. So I just don't love the game script here. I don't like the production we've seen out of Cooper since he's been linked to Deshaun Watson. I don't like the injury that's lingering around. And I just don't like the fact that the Browns have nothing to play for except for potentially some pride and to see what they have going in to next season. So I don't love Amari Cooper. Maybe an okay floor play, but I really don't see any upside. If you have better options at the receiver position or the flex position, I would definitely consider benching Amari Cooper going in to week 17. Next up, we're going to talk about Justin Herbert, which really pains me to say, a quarterback that I loved in the offseason, a quarterback that's had 10.7 or less fantasy points in his last 2 matchups, 6.5 fantasy points against the Colts in week 16. The ceiling for Herbert has just not been there. I mean, I really told you guys I trusted him. I know he had a tough stretch kind of in the midpoint of the season, but he was getting his receivers back healthy, had a good stretch of really favorable matchups, and he performed between weeks 11 and weeks 14. Really disappointed in week 15 in a good matchup against Tennessee, then really disappointed last week against the Colts. He gets the Rams this week, the unit allowing the 9th fewest points to the quarterback position from a fantasy perspective. If you have to roll with Herbert, I think you cross your fingers and you say, okay. But if you have a better upside play at quarterback, you probably want to consider that play over Herbert, because even with his receivers healthy, I just don't see a crazy high ceiling for Justin Herbert going into week 17, as much as it pains me to say. All right, the next quarterback I'm going to mention is GENO Smith, who has 15.3 or less fantasy points in his last 2 matchups, 13.2 last week in a good matchup against the Kansas City Chiefs, 215 passing yards, a touchdown, a pick, and 16 rushing yards. He gets the Jets this week, the unit allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points to the quarterback position. I will say this is potentially a good game script because the Seahawks need to win this game and the Jets need to win this game. If both offenses kind of hum in this game and both defenses kind of bend, then this is a good game script for GENO Smith. Don't get me wrong, he has had some good performances throughout the season against good defenses, but he's also had poor performances like week 15 against the San Francisco 49ers. I really love what we've seen out of GENO Smith this season. He's still your quarterback 7 in fantasy football. But, more than likely, if you own GENO Smith, you own a second quarterback, because Geno was a player you were able to acquire off of the waiver wire throughout the season. If you feel like you have a better option at the quarterback position or a better matchup, I would definitely consider them over GENO Smith going into week 17. All right, I feel like our first tight end is kind of cheating here, going with Mark Andrews, a tight end that, fantasy managers have been panicking on for basically half the season, since week 6 when he hit double digits with 23.6 fantasy points. He's only hit double digits 2 other weeks, weeks 11 and 12. He hit 9.4 in week 13. Outside of that, since week 6, he has given you 7.5 or less fantasy points. In comparison to where you drafted Mark Andrews and the expectations he had, those marks are extremely low ever since Lamar Jackson got injured. You know, we've been all over the place with Mark Andrews, especially when Tyler Huntley got a little bit banged up as well. He gets the Steelers this weekend. Not the best matchup, not the worst matchup. But overall, I just don't think we can trust Mark Andrews. He still comes in as your tight end 3 in full PPR right now. That's how bad the tight end position has been this season. But overall, I think most of you guys would agree there's not a lot to talk about here. If you have better options, a better upside play at tight end, even if it's a guy like Taysom Hill, you might want to consider someone off the waiver wire just to give your team a little bit more upside in what is probably the fantasy championship for you. All right, last but not least, we're going to talk about Darren Waller with the benching of Derek Carr going up against the San Francisco 49ers, the unit allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. I just don't love Darren Waller this week whatsoever. Going to always argue for a backup quarterback like Jarrett Stidham that, you know, the security blanket aspect of a tight end like Darren Waller could give him some decent volume in this game. But, you know, 9.8 fantasy points in week 16 for Waller, 13.8 in week 15. You know, in his return from injury, he hadn't played since week 4 before the last 2 weeks. You know, pretty good overall stat lines for the tight end position in the last 2 weeks. But here against the Niners, a tough matchup, a bad game script, a backup quarterback as a starter. If you have better options, I would strongly consider them over Darren Waller going into week 17 of the season. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. Let me know if you guys own any of the players in today's video and if you guys are considering starting them or if you guys agree that you're probably going to bench them. And of course, if you guys have any questions whatsoever with your roster, please let me know. I'd be happy to help you guys. Be on the lookout for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you there as well. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.